May 8, 1945. Weissenborn, Germany. The spring air carried the scent of lilacs and artillery smoke as American forces established their headquarters in what remained of the once grand town hall. What the arriving soldiers of the United States Army's 761st Tank Battalion expected was a routine occupation of a defeated town. What they could not have imagined was how a cruel joke would blossom into one of the most unexpected and transformative relationships of the European campaign. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how prejudice from all sides was dismantled by simple human decency, and how the daughter of a German officer and an African-American soldier would challenge the assumptions of two nations at war. First Lieutenant James Miller of the 761st Tank Battalion, part of the famed Red Ball Express, stood at attention as Colonel Whitaker addressed the newly arrived company. Miller, at 27 years of age, had joined the Army in 1941 after graduating from Howard University. Despite his education and capabilities, the segregated military limited his responsibilities primarily to supply and logistics rather than combat operations. "Gentlemen," Colonel Whitaker announced to the assembled officers in the makeshift headquarters, "we've secured the area, and several high-ranking German officers have surrendered. Their families are being processed separately." The colonel's weathered face betrayed little emotion as he continued. "Lieutenant Miller, I need you to oversee the temporary housing assignments for the German officers' families until permanent arrangements can be made." "Yes, sir," Miller responded, his voice steady despite the weariness that permeated his 6-foot frame after 3 days without proper sleep. Captain Donnelly, a ruddy-faced officer from Boston with a reputation for crude humor, smirked as he leaned toward the colonel. "Sir, why not have Miller personally escort Oberst von Hoffman's daughter? The look on the old man's face would be priceless." Several officers chuckled, though others shifted uncomfortably. Colonel Whitaker considered for a moment, then nodded. "Make it happen, Lieutenant. Escort Fräulein von Hoffmann to the designated civilian quarters and ensure she's settled." Miller's face remained impassive, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Understood, sir." Tells he what the other officers viewed as a humiliating assignment, forcing a proud German officer to watch his daughter escorted by a black American soldier, Miller saw as simply another duty. What none of them realized was how this assignment would change not just 2 lives, but would later influence hundreds more. Helena von Hoffmann, 22 years old and fluent in English, thanks to her education at a prestigious Swiss boarding school, had spent the war years assisting at a local hospital, while her father, Oberst Wilhelm von Hoffmann, commanded a panzer division. The von Hoffmann family had not been ardent supporters of the German regime, a fact that had actually hindered the Oberst's military advancement, but they had served their country as the family had done for generations. When the Americans arrived, the elegant von Hoffmann estate had already been partially converted into a convalescent home for wounded German soldiers. Helena had been helping 10 to 19 patients, working alongside 2 nurses and a local doctor, who had been deemed too old for military service. Now, standing in the estate's once grand foyer with a small suitcase at her feet, Helena waited for her American escort. Her father had been taken to a processing center for German officers, leaving Helena alone for the first time in her life. Her mother had passed away from pneumonia in 1938, and her 2 brothers had been lost in the Eastern Campaign. When Lieutenant Miller entered the foyer, Helena straightened her posture, her chin lifting slightly in an ingrained gesture of aristocratic dignity. Miller removed his cap and offered a respectful nod. "Fräulein von Hoffmann, I'm Lieutenant James Miller. I've been assigned to escort you to your temporary quarters." Helena studied him with intelligent blue eyes. She had never spoken with an African-American before, having seen them only in propaganda films that portrayed them in demeaning ways. The tall, composed officer before her bore no resemblance to those caricatures. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she replied in accented but fluent English. "I am ready." Miller's eyebrows rose slightly at her English. "You speak English well, Fräulein. I studied at Chateau Montchoisy in Switzerland before the war," she explained as Miller picked up her suitcase. "My father believed languages were essential for a proper education." As they walked out to the waiting jeep, Several American soldiers nearby nudged each other, smirking at the sight of Miller escorting the German woman. Helena noticed their expressions but said nothing, her face a careful mask that revealed none of her uncertainty and fear about the future. The temporary civilian quarters had been established in what was once a hotel near the town center. As they drove through the war-damaged streets, Helena finally spoke again. "May I ask what will happen to my father, Lieutenant?" Miller kept his eyes on the road. "Oberst von Hoffmann will be processed according to his rank. If there's no evidence of involvement in serious violations, he'll likely be held for a period of time, then released after proper denazification procedures." Helena nodded. He was never a member of the party. It caused him considerable difficulty. Miller glanced at her, surprise briefly crossing his features. "That will likely work in his favor, Fräulein." When they arrived at the hotel, Miller carried her suitcase to a small but clean room on the second floor. American military police guarded the entrance to the building, and several other German women, mostly officers' wives and daughters, were already occupying rooms. "Meals are served at 0700, 1200 and 1800 hours, Miller explained, setting down her suitcase. "You're not under arrest, but there's a curfew from 2100 hours until 0600. If you need medical attention, inform the MP at the front desk." Helena sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking much younger than her 22 years. "How long will I be here, Lieutenant?" "I don't know," Miller answered honestly, "but I've been assigned to check on the welfare of the residents here, so I'll keep you informed of any developments regarding your case or your father's." As Miller turned to leave, Helena spoke again. "Thank you for your kindness, Lieutenant. It was not what I expected." Miller paused at the door. "We're not all what the propaganda says, Fräulein, on either side." With that, he nodded and departed. Over the next 3 weeks, Lieutenant Miller visited the temporary housing facility every other day as part of his assigned duties. He noticed that Helena von Hoffmann kept to herself, rarely speaking with the other German women. During his 4th visit, he found her sitting alone in the small garden behind the hotel, reading a tattered copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. "American poetry?" Miller asked, genuinely surprised. Helena looked up, shielding her eyes from the May sunshine. "My English professor at school was quite fond of Whitman. This was her copy. I brought it with me when I returned to Germany in '39. She hesitated, then added, "She was Jewish, Professor Adler. I often wonder what happened to her." Miller sat on the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "You liked her?" "Very much," Helena replied, her fingers tracing the worn cover of the book. "She opened my mind to ideas that—" She stopped herself. "Ideas that became dangerous to express here." Miller nodded, understanding what she couldn't safely say aloud. "Whitman's my favorite too. I am large. I contain multitudes." Helena looked at him with new interest. "You're familiar with Whitman's work." "I studied literature at Howard before the war," Miller explained. "Had plans to teach someday." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Donnelly, who smirked when he saw them sitting together. "Well, well, Lieutenant. Taking your babysitting duties seriously, I see." His tone caused Helena to stiffen beside Miller. Miller stood. "Just checking on the residents as ordered, sir." Donnelly's eyes lingered on Helena. "Colonel Whitaker wants an update on the housing situation. Report to headquarters at 1500 hours." "Yes, sir," Miller replied, his expression neutral despite the captain's tone. After Donnelly left, Helena looked questioningly at Miller. "He intended to insult you by assigning you to escort me, didn't he?" Miller hesitated, then nodded once. "Some men see differences as something to exploit, Fräulein." "Please call me Helena," she said quietly, "and I am sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," Miller replied firmly, "and my name is James." That brief conversation marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, as the American occupation settled into routine and the immediate post-surrender chaos subsided, Miller continued his official visits to the housing facility. Increasingly, he and Helena would find themselves discussing literature, music, and eventually more difficult topics, the war, their families, and the uncertain future facing them both. On a warm June evening, Miller arrived at the housing facility with news. "Your father is being transferred to a processing center in Frankfurt. He told Helena as they walked through the small garden. His case is proceeding well. There's no evidence of war crimes or party membership, so he'll likely be released within a few months. Helena's relief was evident. Thank you for telling me, and for being kind throughout this time. Miller shrugged slightly. It's nothing more than anyone deserves. Helena stopped walking and turned to face him. No, Lieutenant James, it is more, much more. The other soldiers, they look through us as if we aren't human, or they look at us with anger, or worse. She didn't elaborate on worse, but her meaning was clear. You have treated me with dignity when you had every reason not to. Before Miller could respond, they heard a commotion from the street. Rushing to investigate, they found a small crowd gathered around a local boy of about 12 who had been struck by a military jeep. The driver, a young private, stood panicking nearby as the boy lay motionless on the cobblestones. Without hesitation, Helena pushed through the onlookers and knelt beside the boy, checking his pulse and breathing. He's alive, but unconscious, she announced, then began examining him with practiced movements. Possible broken ribs, likely concussion. Miller knelt beside her. You have medical training. 3 years at the hospital, Helena replied, not looking up as she continued her examination. We need to get him proper care quickly. Miller immediately took command of the situation, ordering the jeep driver to prepare his vehicle to transport the boy. Helena insisted on accompanying them to maintain the boy's stability during transport. At the American Field Hospital, the medical staff initially hesitated to treat a German civilian until Miller firmly invoked Colonel Whitaker's standing orders regarding humanitarian aid. While the doctors treated the boy, Helena translated for his frantic mother, who had followed them to the hospital. Miller watched as Helena comforted the woman, struck by her compassion despite her own uncertain circumstances. When they finally left the hospital hours later, the boy stabilized and expected to recover. Night had fallen. They walked in comfortable silence back toward the housing facility, the streets mostly empty under the military curfew. You were a nurse during the war? Miller asked eventually. Helena nodded. Not officially trained, but with so many medical personnel sent to the front, we all learned quickly. She hesitated before continuing. I worked with all patients who came to our hospital. Miller understood her unspoken meaning. Including Allied prisoners? Yes, she said quietly. Some of the staff would neglect them. I did not. Miller nodded, saying nothing but understanding the risk she had taken. As they reached the housing facility, Helena turned to him. James, thank you for ensuring the boy received treatment. Many would not have bothered. You're the one who knew what to do, Miller replied. I'm just glad I could help. The incident with the injured boy changed things between them, establishing a trust that transcended their official roles as occupier and occupied. It also caught the attention of Major Samuel Lewis, the medical officer overseeing the field hospital, who requested Helena's assistance with other German patients, particularly children who were frightened by the American doctors. Colonel Whitaker approved the arrangement, seeing the practical benefit of having a German-speaking assistant at the hospital, though Captain Donnelly continued to make snide remarks about fraternizing with the enemy. Miller was assigned as Helena's official escort to and from the hospital each day, a duty that Captain Donnelly clearly intended as another joke at Miller's expense, but which neither Miller nor Helena minded. By mid-July, Helena had become an invaluable asset at the field hospital, where her gentle manner and fluent German reassured frightened patients, while her growing medical knowledge impressed the American doctors. Miller, meanwhile, had been given increased responsibilities overseeing supply distributions to the recovering town, earning the respect of both his fellow officers and the local German officials with whom he worked. On July 15th, news arrived that Helena's father had been cleared of any significant wrongdoing and would be released within a month. Miller brought the news personally to Helena at the hospital, finding her bandaging a young German girl's arm. Danke schön, Fräulein Helena, the little girl said as Helena finished tying the bandage. Bitte sehr, Liebling, Helena replied with a warm smile, then noticed Miller waiting nearby. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, a softening, a light in her eyes that had been absent when they first met. After the girl left with her mother, Miller shared the news about her father. Helena's relief was palpable. "That's wonderful news," she said, then hesitated. Although, Miller prompted when she didn't continue. Helena looked down at her hands. "It means I will likely be leaving soon." She met his eyes again. "I have come to value our conversations greatly, James." Miller nodded, feeling an unexpected tightness in his chest at the thought of her departure. "As have I, Helena." Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Major Lewis, who needed Helena's assistance with a new patient. As she hurried away, Miller found himself watching her go, suddenly aware of how much their daily interactions had come to mean to him. That evening, as Miller drove Helena back to the housing facility, she broke their comfortable silence. "What will you do after the war, James? Will you become a teacher as you planned?" Miller kept his eyes on the road. "If I can, though I'm not sure what opportunities will be available for someone like me back home." Helena considered this. "Because of your race?" "Yes," Miller answered simply. "Things are changing, but slowly. The army's still segregated, as you've seen. Civilian life isn't much different." "That seems incomprehensible," Helena said slowly, "after fighting for your country." Miller glanced at her. "What about you? Will you return to the estate?" Helena shook her head. "It's been requisitioned, and without my brothers—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "I would like to continue in medicine, perhaps become a proper nurse or even a doctor if it's possible." "You'd be excellent," Miller said with genuine admiration. "You have a natural gift for it." As they arrived at the housing facility, Helena didn't immediately get out of the jeep. "James," she said hesitantly, "would you consider writing to me after I leave? I would very much like to remain in contact." Miller was momentarily surprised by the request, then nodded. "I'd like that too." The next day, Miller was summoned to Colonel Whitaker's office, where he found Captain Donnelly already present, a smug expression on his face. "Lieutenant Miller," Colonel Whitaker began formally, "it has come to my attention that your interactions with Fräulein von Hoffmann may have exceeded the boundaries of professional duty." Miller stood at attention. "Sir, I have maintained proper protocol at all times. My duties as Fräulein von Hoffmann's escort to and from the hospital have been carried out as ordered." "That's not what I've heard," Captain Donnelly interjected. "Several witnesses report seeing you engaged in lengthy personal conversations with the German woman, sitting together in the garden, even sharing books." "Is this true, Lieutenant?" Colonel Whitaker asked, his expression unreadable. "We have conversed during our time together, yes, sir," Miller acknowledged. "Fräulein von Hoffmann speaks excellent English and has been extremely helpful in facilitating communication with German patients at the hospital. Major Lewis can confirm her value to our medical operations." Colonel Whitaker studied Miller for a long moment. "Lieutenant, I assigned you to this duty partly because Captain Donnelly suggested it would be instructive for the German officer's daughter. I did not anticipate that you would develop a personal relationship with her. Sir, with respect, Fräulein von Hoffmann has proven herself to be an intelligent, compassionate individual who has gone above and beyond to assist our medical personnel. Our conversations have been proper and often related to her work at the hospital." Colonel Whitaker sighed, looking suddenly tired. "Miller, you're a good officer. Your work with local supply distribution has been exemplary, but you must understand the complications that could arise from too close an association with a German national, particularly one of Fräulein von Hoffmann's background." "Sir," Miller replied steadily, "I understand my responsibilities and the complexity of our current situation. I can assure you that neither Fräulein von Hoffmann nor I have done anything to compromise military operations or protocols." After a long pause, Colonel Whitaker nodded. "Very well, Lieutenant. You will continue your assigned duties, including escorting Fräulein von Hoffmann to and from the hospital. However, I would advise discretion in your interactions. Perception can be as important as reality in our position here." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," Miller responded, aware of Captain Donnelly's dissatisfied expression. As Miller left the office, Captain Donnelly followed him into the hallway. "You know, Miller, when I suggested this assignment, it was supposed to be a joke. The look on that German officer's face seeing his precious daughter escorted by a colored soldier. "I didn't expect you to start courting her." Miller turned to face Donnelly, his expression controlled but his eyes hard. "Captain, Fräulein von Hoffmann has been a valuable asset to our medical operations. My treatment of her reflects the professionalism expected of an American officer. Nothing more, nothing less." Donnelly snorted. "Just remember your place, Lieutenant, and hers." As Miller walked away, he reflected on Donnelly's words, not in anger, but in careful consideration. What exactly was his place now? What was Helena's? In a world being rapidly reshaped by the aftermath of the most devastating conflict in human history, old boundaries and prejudices were being challenged, though not nearly quickly enough. That evening, when Miller arrived at the hospital to escort Helena back to her quarters, he found her finishing paperwork with Major Lewis. The Major looked up with a smile. "Lieutenant, perfect timing. I was just telling Fräulein von Hoffmann that her assistance has been invaluable. In fact, I've written a letter of recommendation that she might use to pursue nursing studies after she's settled." Helena's face glowed with surprise and pleasure. "It's very generous of you, Major Lewis." As they drove back to the housing facility, Helena clutched the letter tightly. "This could make a real difference for my future," she said, her voice filled with cautious hope. "After everything, to have a chance to start again." Miller glanced at her, struck by how different she looked from the proud, fearful young woman he had first met. There was a resilience to her now, a determined brightness. "You've earned it, Helena. The staff respects you tremendously." She turned to him, her expression earnest. "And what about you, James? What do you think of me now compared to when we first met?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Miller slowed the jeep, considering his answer carefully. "When we first met, I saw someone trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation," he finally said. "Now I see who you truly are. Compassionate, intelligent, and remarkably brave. Someone who chooses to help others, even when she has every reason to withdraw." Helena's eyes shimmered in the fading light. "And I see a man who showed me kindness when it would have been easier not to, who treats everyone with the respect he himself is often denied." She paused. "A man I have come to admire greatly." The words between them remained cautious, proper, but the understanding that passed between their eyes spoke of deeper feelings neither could safely express. As July turned to August, the news from around the world continued to reshape the post-war landscape. Reports of the devastating weapon used against Japan reached their small corner of Germany, along with rumors of imminent Japanese surrender. For the American forces, thoughts increasingly turned toward home and what awaited them there. For Helena, news arrived that her father would be released and returning to Weissenborn within the week. Her initial joy was tempered by the realization that this also meant decisions about her future would soon need to be made. The von Hoffmann estate remained requisitioned, though there was talk of partial return of the property to the family once denazification procedures were complete. For Lieutenant Miller, orders came preparing his unit for redeployment, likely back to the United States within the next 2 months. The war was ending and the great machine of military logistics was already beginning to wind down. On August 5th, Helena was working at the hospital when a familiar voice caught her attention. Turning, she saw her father, thinner, grayer, but unmistakably Oberst Wilhelm von Hoffmann, standing in the entrance of the ward, accompanied by an American military police officer. "Father!" Helena exclaimed, rushing to embrace him. The Oberst held his daughter tightly, his normally stern face softening with emotion. "Helena, meine Tochter, you are well? They have treated you properly?" "Yes, Father, I am fine," Helena assured him, leading him to a quiet corner of the ward. "I have been working here at the hospital. The American doctors have been very kind." Oberst von Hoffmann glanced around the ward, his military bearing still evident despite his civilian clothes. "So I have been told. Your work here was mentioned during my processing. It seems to have worked in my favor." Helena smiled. "Major Lewis has even written me a recommendation letter for nursing studies." Her father studied her face. "You have changed, Helena." "The world has changed, Father," she replied gently. Before they could continue their conversation, Lieutenant Miller entered the ward, stopping short when he saw Oberst von Hoffmann. The two men regarded each other carefully. Helena stood. "Father, this is Lieutenant James Miller. He has been my escort to and from the hospital and has been very kind to me during your absence." Miller approached and extended his hand. "Oberst von Hoffmann, it's good to see you reunited with your daughter." The Oberst hesitated only briefly before shaking Miller's hand. "Lieutenant, I understand you have treated my daughter with respect." "She has earned the respect of everyone here, sir," Miller replied evenly. "Her work has been invaluable." The Oberst nodded slowly, his eyes moving between his daughter and the American officer. Whatever his thoughts, he kept them to himself. "Helena, we have been granted temporary use of a house in town until our situation is clarified," he said. "You can come home with me today, if you wish." Helena looked momentarily torn, glancing at her unfinished work and then at Miller. "I should finish my shift, Father. Lieutenant Miller can bring me to the new house afterward, if that's acceptable." The Oberst's expression was unreadable as he nodded. "Very well, I will expect you this evening." He turned to Miller. "Lieutenant." After her father left, Helena exhaled slowly. "He seems different." "War changes everyone," Miller observed quietly. Helena met his eyes. "Yes, sometimes for the better." The unspoken question between them, what would happen now, remained unanswered as they returned to their duties. That evening, as Miller drove Helena to her father's temporary residence, the atmosphere between them felt charged with unspoken words. When they arrived, Miller carried her small suitcase to the door. "Helena," he began, then hesitated, searching for the right words. "Your father's return changes things." Helena nodded. "Yes, but not everything has to change, James." She took a deep breath. "Would you come for dinner tomorrow, to meet my father properly?" Miller looked surprised. "Are you sure that's wise?" "No," Helena admitted with a small smile. "But it's what I want, please." After a moment's hesitation, Miller nodded. "I'll come. 1900 hours." "Yes," Helena confirmed, her smile brightening. "Goodbye for now, James." As Miller drove away, he wondered what tomorrow's dinner would bring, and what it might mean for both their futures in this uncertain new world they were helping to rebuild. The following evening, Lieutenant James Miller arrived at the small house that now served as the von Hoffmann residence. Precisely at 1900 hours, he wore his dress uniform, freshly pressed, and carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. The modest two-story home stood in stark contrast to the grand estate the family had once occupied, but it was clean and intact, a rarity in the war-damaged town of Weissenborn. Miller hesitated briefly before knocking on the door. He had spent the day wondering if this dinner invitation was wise. Captain Donnelly had already expressed disapproval of Miller's professional relationship with Helena. A social visit to her home would only fuel further criticism. Yet Miller found himself unwilling to decline the invitation, drawn by something more powerful than concern for military protocol or social convention. The door opened to reveal Helena, dressed in a simple blue dress that Miller had never seen before. Her blonde hair, usually pulled back severely during her hospital work, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "James," she greeted him with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you came." "Thank you for inviting me," Miller replied, handing her the package. "Just a small gift." Helena unwrapped it to find a bar of American chocolate and a paperback copy of Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. "The chocolate is for tonight," Miller explained with a slight smile. "The book is for later. I thought you might enjoy it." "Thank you," Helena said, clearly touched by the gesture. "Please come in. Father is waiting in the sitting room." The interior of the house was sparsely furnished, but meticulously kept. In the small sitting room, Oberst Wilhelm von Hoffmann stood as they entered. At 57, he remained an imposing figure despite having lost weight during his detention. He wore civilian clothes, a white shirt and dark trousers, but his military bearing was unmistakable. "Lieutenant Miller." The Oberst greeted him formally, extending his hand. "Oberst von Hoffmann," Miller replied, shaking the offered hand. "Thank you for allowing me into your home." The Oberst gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit. Helena tells me you were instrumental in securing her position at the hospital." Miller sat, his posture straight but not stiff. "Your daughter's skills secured her own position, sir. I merely facilitated the introduction." Helena brought in a tray with a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. "This is from the last of Father's collection. We've been saving it." As she poured, the Oberst studied Miller carefully. "My daughter speaks highly of you, Lieutenant. She says you treated her with dignity when others did not." Miller met the older man's gaze steadily. "Fräulein von Hoffmann deserves nothing less, sir." A subtle expression, perhaps surprise, perhaps approval, crossed the Oberst's face. "Indeed," he raised his glass, "to unexpected kindnesses in difficult times." The toast set the tone for the evening, which proceeded with a formality that gradually eased as the meal progressed. Helena had prepared a simple but well-executed dinner from their rations and vegetables from a small garden behind the house. Throughout the meal, Miller observed the interaction between father and daughter with interest. There was clearly deep affection between them, though the Oberst maintained a certain reserve that seemed as much a product of his generation and upbringing as his military background. After dinner, as Helena cleared the plates, the Oberst addressed Miller directly. "Lieutenant, may I speak frankly?" "Of course, sir," Miller replied, prepared for the conversation he had been anticipating all evening. "When I learned that my daughter had been assigned an American escort, I was concerned," the Oberst began carefully. "When I discovered that escort was—" He hesitated, clearly searching for appropriate wording. "A soldier of your background, I confess I was alarmed." Miller kept his expression neutral, waiting for the older man to continue. "I assumed it was meant as a deliberate insult," the Oberst continued, "a final humiliation for a defeated officer. It was intended that way by some," Miller acknowledged quietly. The Oberst nodded slowly. "So I gathered. Yet my daughter tells me you never once treated her with anything but courtesy and respect, that you defended her when others would not, and that you helped her secure work that has given her purpose during a difficult time." He paused, his eyes intent on Miller's face. "I find myself in the unexpected position of owing you a debt of gratitude, Lieutenant." Before Miller could respond, Helena returned from the kitchen. Something in the atmosphere made her pause, looking questioningly between the two men. "Your father and I were discussing how situations can turn out differently than expected," Miller explained with subtle diplomacy. "Indeed," the Oberst agreed, his expression softening slightly as he looked at his daughter. "Helena, Lieutenant Miller and I have had a frank exchange. I believe I understand now why you hold him in such high regard." Helena smiled, relief evident in her expression. "I'm glad, Father." As the evening drew to a close, Miller thanked them both for their hospitality. At the door, the Oberst shook his hand again, this time with genuine firmness. "You are welcome in our home, Lieutenant Miller," he said formally. "Perhaps you would join us again before your unit is redeployed." "I would be honored, sir," Miller replied sincerely. Helena walked Miller to his jeep under the August night sky bright with stars. They stood for a moment in silence, both aware of boundaries still between them, but feeling them shift. "Thank you for coming tonight," Helena said softly. "It meant a great deal to me." "And to me," Miller responded. "Your father is an interesting man." Helena smiled. "He is traditional in many ways, but fair, and he values honesty above all." She hesitated, then added, "He sees the same quality in you, I think." Miller nodded, understanding the significance of her words. "Good night, Helena." "Good night, James." As Miller drove back to the American headquarters, he found himself contemplating the unexpected turns his life had taken since arriving in Weissenborn. What had begun as a cruel joke had evolved into something neither he nor Captain Donnelly could have anticipated, a genuine connection that transcended the barriers of nationality, background, and the recent enmity of war. The following weeks brought rapid changes, as news of Japan's surrender transformed the military situation. Redeployment orders accelerated, with many units receiving instructions to prepare for return to the United States by October. Lieutenant Miller's 761st Tank Battalion was scheduled among the earlier departures, with a projected departure date of September 20th. Helena continued her work at the hospital, though with the most critical cases evacuated and fewer new patients arriving, The atmosphere had shifted from urgent medical care to longer-term rehabilitation. Major Lewis had begun suggesting that Helena consider applying to nursing programs in the United States, where opportunities for advanced medical training would be greater than in war-devastated Germany. The Army has established scholarship programs for medical personnel, he explained one afternoon, as Helena assisted him with a young patient's physical therapy. Given your experience and my recommendation, you would be a strong candidate. Helena's expression revealed both interest and hesitation. America is very far, Major Lewis. The Major glanced meaningfully toward the supply area where Lieutenant Miller was conducting an inventory. Sometimes distance is just geography, Fräulein von Hoffmann. On September 3rd, the American forces in Weissenborn organized a small celebration to mark the official end of the war. The town hall, partially rebuilt through joint American and German civilian efforts, hosted a modest gathering where military personnel and local officials attempted to navigate the delicate transition from occupation to reconstruction. Helena attended with her father, who had been invited as a gesture of reconciliation by Colonel Whitaker. Lieutenant Miller, now serving as liaison between American forces and local German authorities for distribution of rebuilding supplies, was busy ensuring the event proceeded smoothly. Captain Donnelly, his face flushed from too much celebratory whiskey, approached Helena as she stood near the refreshment table. "Well, if it isn't the German princess," he said loudly enough to draw attention from nearby guests. "Still got Miller jumping to attention, I see." Oberst von Hoffmann, standing nearby in conversation with Colonel Whitaker, stiffened but remained silent, watching to see how his daughter would respond. Helena met Donnelly's gaze calmly. "Captain Donnelly, I believe. Lieutenant Miller speaks of the challenges you've overcome together. It must be gratifying to see the war concluded successfully." Her dignified response clearly wasn't what Donnelly had expected. He frowned, thrown off balance by her poise. "Yeah, well, some of us did the real fighting, while others played chauffeur to German girls," he muttered. Colonel Whitaker, who had overheard the exchange, stepped forward. "Captain Donnelly, I believe Sergeant Adams needs assistance coordinating the transport schedule for tomorrow's supply delivery." Recognizing the dismissal, Donnelly offered a stiff salute and walked away, his expression sullen. "Please accept my apologies, Fräulein von Hoffmann," Colonel Whitaker said quietly. "Not all of our officers reflect the standards we aspire to maintain." "No apology necessary, Colonel," Helena replied graciously. "In difficult times we all must focus on building bridges rather than dwelling on past conflicts." Colonel Whitaker smiled appreciatively at her response, then turned to Oberst von Hoffmann. "You have an exceptional daughter, Oberst." "Indeed I do, Colonel," the Oberst agreed, his pride evident. "She has always demonstrated wisdom beyond her years." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Lieutenant Miller finally had a moment to speak with Helena and her father. "I apologize for being so busy this evening," he said, joining them at their table. "Duty comes first, Lieutenant," the Oberst observed. "Something military men understand regardless of nationality." Miller nodded in acknowledgement. "Still, I had hoped to spend more time discussing the university rebuilding project with you both. Helena mentioned your interest in contributing to the Educational Restoration Committee." "Yes," the Oberst confirmed. "In my younger days, before the military career, I lectured in European history. I would find it fulfilling to assist in rebuilding educational institutions." As they discussed the possibilities for educational reconstruction, Miller noticed Helena watching him with a particular intensity. When the Oberst excused himself briefly to speak with a former colleague, she leaned closer. "James, I've been offered an opportunity to apply for nursing training in America," she said quietly. "Major Lewis believes I could qualify for a special program." Miller felt his heart rate quicken. "That's wonderful news, Helena. You would be an exceptional candidate." "It would mean leaving Germany," she continued, studying his reaction carefully. "Leaving everything I've known." Miller understood the unspoken question in her words. Some journeys are worth making even when difficult. "And would I have a friend in America?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone to help me understand a new world?" Before Miller could respond, the Oberst returned, and the moment passed. But the question lingered between them, filled with possibility. The next morning, Miller was summoned to Colonel Whitaker's office. He found the colonel reviewing deployment papers, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant Miller, I've been impressed with your work in Weissenborn," the colonel began without preamble. "Your handling of supply distribution and civilian relations has been exemplary." "Thank you, sir," Miller replied, standing at attention. "I've received a request from military government headquarters in Frankfurt." The colonel continued. "They're establishing a new department focused on educational reconstruction. They need officers with both administrative skills and an understanding of educational systems." He looked up at Miller. "Your background in literature and education before the war makes you uniquely qualified. I've recommended you for a 6-month extension assignment in Frankfurt, should you be interested." Miller was momentarily speechless. Such an assignment would not only be professionally significant, but would mean remaining in Germany long after his unit had returned to the States. The assignment would include working with German educators and administrators who have been cleared through denazification. Colonel Whitaker added, "I understand Oberst von Hoffmann has experience in academic settings. His name has been suggested as a potential local liaison." Miller maintained his professional demeanor despite his rising excitement. "I would be very interested in this assignment, sir." Colonel Whitaker nodded, a slight smile suggesting he understood more than he was saying. "I thought you might be. I'll inform Frankfurt of your acceptance. You'll remain with your unit until they deploy, then report to Frankfurt on September 25th. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir," Miller said sincerely. "You've earned it, Lieutenant," the colonel replied. Dismissed. Miller left headquarters with a sense of possibility he hadn't felt since before the war. That afternoon, when he arrived at the hospital to discuss medical supply allocations with Major Lewis, he sought out Helena during her break. Finding her in the small courtyard where they had shared many conversations, Miller sat beside her on the now familiar bench. "I've been offered a new assignment," he told her, watching her expression carefully. "Educational reconstruction in Frankfurt. A 6-month extension after my unit deploys." Helena's eyes widened slightly. "You're staying in Germany?" Miller nodded. "And your father's name has been suggested as a local liaison for the project." Understanding dawned in Helena's eyes. "So we would both be in Frankfurt?" "Potentially, yes," Miller confirmed. "And Frankfurt happens to have an excellent nursing program that's being re-established with American assistance." Helena's smile grew slowly. "What a remarkable coincidence. I've found that sometimes people of goodwill can help create fortunate circumstances." Miller replied with a meaningful glance toward the administrative building, where Major Lewis's office was located. 2 days later, Miller joined Helena and her father for dinner again, this time to formally discuss the Frankfurt opportunity. The Oberst, while initially cautious, showed growing enthusiasm as Miller outlined the Educational Reconstruction Initiative. To help rebuild proper academic institutions, free from ideological constraints, the Oberst said thoughtfully, it would be deeply satisfying work. "And Helena could pursue her nursing studies there," Miller added. "Major Lewis has already written to colleagues at the Frankfurt Medical Academy." The Oberst looked between Miller and his daughter, his expression revealing his awareness of the unspoken current between them. "It seems Frankfurt offers opportunities for both my daughter and myself. A new beginning, perhaps." "New beginnings are what we're all seeking now, sir," Miller replied quietly. As September progressed, preparations for deployment accelerated. Miller's unit would be leaving as scheduled, but he would remain behind for his special assignment. Captain Donnelly, upon learning of Miller's extended assignment, made a final attempt to undermine him. "Staying behind to continue your German romance. Lieutenant," he remarked within earshot of several other officers. "How convenient." Colonel Whitaker, passing nearby, overheard the comment. "Captain Donnelly," he said sharply, "Lieutenant Miller is remaining on official assignment at the request of military government headquarters, an assignment for which, I might add, your name was not considered." Donnelly's face reddened as the other officers poorly concealed their amusement at his discomfort. The captain offered a stiff salute and walked away without further comment. On September 19th, the day before his unit's departure, Miller visited the von Hoffmann house to finalize arrangements for their relocation to Frankfurt the following week. Helena met him at the door, her expression unusually serious. "James, father would like to speak with you privately," she said, leading him to the small study where the Oberst waited. "Lieutenant Miller," the Oberst began formally after Helena had left them alone, "I wish to speak plainly about a matter of importance." "Of course, sir," Miller replied, sensing the significance of the moment. The Oberst gestured for Miller to sit, then took the chair opposite him. "Over these past months I have observed your interactions with my daughter. I have seen the respect and admiration that has grown between you, and I am not blind to the deeper feelings that neither of you has spoken aloud." Miller remained silent, allowing the older man to continue. "In the world before this war, I would have considered such a connection impossible," the Oberst continued frankly. "Not because of any deficiency in your character, quite the contrary. You have proven yourself to be a man of exceptional quality, but because the world would not have permitted it." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "But this war has destroyed much of what we thought we understood about the world. Perhaps that destruction makes space for new understandings, new possibilities." "Sir," Miller began carefully, "I hold your daughter in the highest regard." The Oberst raised a hand, interrupting gently. "Lieutenant, James, you need not be diplomatic. I am asking quite directly what your intentions are regarding my daughter." Miller took a deep breath, then spoke with complete honesty. "I care for Helena deeply, more than I thought possible when we first met. If circumstances were different, if the world were different, I would hope to court her properly, with your blessing." "And do you believe the world has changed enough?" the Oberst asked quietly. Miller considered the question seriously. "Not entirely, no. Both Helena and I would face difficulties that would test anyone's resolve. In America, in Germany, there would be obstacles." The Oberst nodded, appreciating Miller's candor. "Life is rarely simple, Lieutenant, and happiness is never guaranteed. But I have come to believe that courage is not just for the battlefield." He leaned forward slightly. "If my daughter chooses a path with you, and if you are prepared to walk that path with all its challenges, you will have my blessing." Miller was momentarily speechless, having expected anything but this response. "Thank you, sir," he finally managed. "That means more than I can express." The Oberst stood, indicating their private conversation had concluded. "I believe Helena is waiting rather anxiously in the garden. Perhaps you should join her." Miller found Helena sitting beside the small fish pond, her fingers trailing in the water. She looked up as he approached, her expression questioning. "Your father is a remarkable man," Miller said as he sat beside her. "What did he say to you?" Helena asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Miller took her hand, a gesture he had never permitted himself before. "He said that courage is not just for the battlefield." Helena's eyes brightened with understanding and hope. "And what do you think, James?" "I think," he said carefully, "that the most worthwhile journeys are often the most difficult." He met her gaze directly. "Helena, when we go to Frankfurt, I would like to court you properly if you're willing. I can't promise it will be easy." "Easy is rarely worthwhile," Helena interrupted softly, turning her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. "And I have never sought the easy path." "People will talk," Miller warned, "in both our countries." Helena smiled. "Let them. We've seen enough of the world's hatred. Perhaps it's time to show them something different." The following day, Miller stood with his unit as they prepared for departure. His fellow soldiers, with whom he had served for nearly 4 years, offered handshakes and good wishes for his special assignment. Even Captain Donnelly, perhaps sensing the changing tide, gave a curt nod of acknowledgement. Colonel Whitaker approached as the troops began boarding the transport vehicles. "Your paperwork for Frankfurt is in order, Lieutenant. Report to Major Edwards at headquarters there on the 25th. "Yes, sir. Thank you again for the recommendation." The colonel smiled slightly. "Sometimes the right person and the right opportunity find each other, Miller. Good luck in Frankfurt." He glanced toward the edge of the assembly area where Helena stood with her father, waiting to say goodbye. "In all your endeavors." After the colonel moved away, Miller approached Helena and the Oberst. Military protocol dictated restraint, but he allowed himself to take Helena's hand briefly. "I'll see you in Frankfurt next week," he said simply. "We'll be there," she replied, her eyes conveying what words could not in such a public setting. On September 25th, 1945, Lieutenant James Miller reported for duty at the Educational Reconstruction Division in Frankfurt, Germany. That same day, Helena von Hoffmann and her father arrived in the city, where Helena would soon begin her studies at the Frankfurt Medical Academy under the sponsorship program arranged by Major Lewis. Their story, which began as a cruel joke meant to humiliate both a German officer's daughter and a black American soldier, continued long after the immediate aftermath of the war. In the years that followed, both James and Helena would face challenges from those who could not accept their relationship, but they also found unexpected allies and support. In 1947, when James's extended assignment concluded and he returned to America to complete his education under the GI Bill, Helena accompanied him as his wife, a union blessed by her father and celebrated by friends they had made among both Germans and Americans who had witnessed their relationship develop. James Miller would go on to become Dr. James Miller, professor of literature at Howard University, while Helena completed her medical training to become Dr. Helena Miller, specializing in pediatric care. Together, they would raise 3 children who would grow up understanding that courage comes in many forms and that dignity can flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. In 1965, 20 years after their first meeting, James and Helena Miller would return to Weissenborn for the dedication of a new university building named in honor of Oberst Wilhelm von Hoffmann, who had devoted his post-war years to educational reconstruction until his passing in 1958. At the ceremony, now retired Colonel Whitaker would remark that from the ashes of conflict, the most important reconstruction had been not of buildings but of understanding between people. Their story would become known among those who served in the occupation forces as an example of how individual acts of decency could transcend the broader hatreds of war. For the soldiers who had witnessed Captain Donnelly's joke assignment that first day in Weissenborn, the outcome would serve as a powerful reminder that treating others with dignity, even those recently considered enemies, reflected the highest ideals their uniform was meant to represent. For Helena and James, what began as a cruel attempt to humiliate them both became instead the foundation for a lifetime of shared purpose and devotion. The officer's daughter, handed to a black American soldier as a joke, had indeed been treated like a queen, not through grand gestures or special privileges, but through the most revolutionary act of all, being seen and respected for exactly who she was. In the tumultuous decades that followed the war, as both the United States and Germany confronted their histories and struggled toward more just societies, James and Helena Miller would stand as living testimony to the possibility of building bridges across the deepest divides of human experience. Their legacy would extend far beyond their personal happiness, touching the lives of students, patients, and all who learned their story. The lesson they embodied was both simple and profound, that human dignity, once recognized and honored, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but the wider world. It was a lesson born in the aftermath of humanity's darkest hour, proof that even from the most terrible conflicts, seeds of hope can emerge and flourish. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.